In Akron, Ohio, June is typically the gloomiest and wettest month of the year. But on one particular morning in June of 2001, when Akron resident Jeff Zack poked his head out of his bedroom window, he was thrilled to discover that the sun was out and the sky was clear. Jeff immediately rushed to his closet to change into his yard work clothes. He pulled on a t-shirt, and then he zipped up a pair of beat-up old cargo shorts, and then he raced down the stairs, grabbed his pruning shears, and then dashed out the back door without even putting his shoes on. On the stoop behind his house, the 44-year-old gardening enthusiast / professional landscaper paused briefly to admire his work. Although Jeff's backyard was a pretty standard size and shape for an American house in the suburbs, it was filled with lush green grass that was always perfectly cut, and around the perimeter of the yard, Jeff had planted the colorful rose bushes that were just about to reach their peak bloom. After stepping down the few back steps, Jeff began marching across his beautiful grass toward his rose bushes to do some pruning. As he walked along, he smiled to himself, feeling certain he must have the best landscaping in the whole neighborhood. Jeff was a very competitive guy, and so he loved being the best at things. But as much as he'd love to say that he had some kind of magical touch with plants, the truth was, Jeff just understood how plants worked. Give them the right mixture of sunlight, soil, and water, and plants will reward you with fruit and flowers. Simple. But as Jeff lifted his pruning shears to make the first cut, he heard his wife Bonnie calling to him from the kitchen about breakfast being ready, and he was instantly reminded that people were not like plants. People were complicated. You could give them everything they ever thought they wanted, and still they'd be miserable. And as Jeff cut back the errant stems of his rose bush, he thought about how his relationship with Bonnie was a perfect example of this. Jeff and Bonnie had gotten married 15 years ago. At the time, they wanted the same things in life, stability and family, and they were both very physically attracted to each other. So, logically speaking, their marriage should have worked out perfectly. But it didn't, at least not to Jeff. Even though Bonnie had given Jeff the family and the stability he'd always wanted, and she still was very attractive to him, there were still times when Jeff just could not stand to look at her. And sometimes just the sound of her voice, even when she was doing something nice, like that morning calling out to him to let him know that she had made him breakfast, was like nails on a chalkboard for Jeff. And not because Bonnie was a bad person or bad wife. Really, it was the opposite. She was a great wife who'd given him everything he thought he wanted, but still, Jeff just felt unhappy. And unfortunately, his unhappiness had led to bitter resentment of his wife. However, recently, Jeff had begun telling himself that it was him who needed to make changes, not his wife. And so, over the last month, Jeff had been making a very conscious effort to be kinder, more patient, and less hot-headed when he was around his wife and also his son. But every day was a struggle. After cutting one more stem on his rose bush, Jeff stood up and walked back over to the door leading into the house. He paused just outside of it and took a few deep breaths to calm down. He knew he felt annoyed with his wife for really no other reason than he heard her voice, but he told himself today he would do his best to be a better husband and a better father. Jeff wiped his feet on the mat, and then he opened the door and stepped inside. Less than an hour later, Jeff had fallen back into his old angry ways and was screaming at his wife Bonnie for no apparent reason and saying he wanted a divorce. Moments later, Jeff was storming outside, slamming the front door behind him. Once outside, Jeff clambered into his Ford Explorer SUV parked in the driveway, and after firing the engine up, he flew out of the driveway and just started driving. For the next couple of hours, Jeff drove around the city aimlessly, honking and yelling at other drivers, and just kind of generally taking out his anger on anyone who happened to come near him. But at a certain point during this kind of crazed drive around town, Jeff realized he actually had a lot of errands he needed to run, so he decided he would start doing those. Jeff usually had a lot of errands to run because he worked in a lot of different businesses. In addition to professionally landscaping, Jeff also worked as a handyman, he did some flooring work, and he also owned and operated a slew of vending machines around town. As Jeff was getting ready to head to a hardware store for his first errand, he looked down and he realized he was very low on gas. So instead of going to the hardware store, Jeff decided he would go to BJ's. BJ's is a big American wholesale store, and it's where Jeff went every Saturday to buy items for his various vending machines. BJ's also had their own gas station right out front near the parking lot, so Jeff figured he could get the gas he needed for his car and then also knock out a vending machine refill run. When Jeff arrived out front of BJ's and looked at the parking lot and the gas station, he was immediately struck by how crowded the place seemed. Now, BJ's is a very popular store, and the parking lot is usually full of people, but this day it just seemed like there were way more people than usual. But when Jeff looked at his watch and saw the date, he knew why. It was Saturday, June 16th, the day before Father's Day, and so most likely, all these people were here getting all the things they would need for their celebration the next day. Things like hot dogs and hamburgers, chips, soda, lawn chairs, charcoal for grills. Father's Day is a big cookout day in the US. And as Jeff thought about Father's Day, his heart sunk. What a terrible father and husband he had been that morning, yelling at his wife and slamming the door on the way out. Suddenly, all Jeff wanted to do was rush home, say he was sorry, and give his wife and son a big hug. So he whipped his Ford Explorer into the gas station right up alongside an open pump, and as quick as he could, he got to work getting the nozzle into his car to start filling up. There were so many vehicles moving in and out of the gas station that Jeff didn't even notice the motorcyclist in the full-faced helmet pull up right behind him. After filling his car's tank and then putting the pump back in the holster, Jeff climbed back inside of his car. And there, sitting behind the wheel, Jeff glanced over at all the happy families buzzing around the BJ's parking lot, loading their Father's Day celebration goods into their cars, and as he watched, Jeff felt another pang of regret about how he had acted that morning. Luckily, he'd be home soon, he could apologize, and maybe even salvage a fun Father's Day the next day. But before Jeff could fire up his car's engine, the motorcyclist in the full-faced helmet that had pulled up behind Jeff walked up to Jeff's driver's side window. Jeff noticed him and looked up at him through his window very inquisitively, and as he did this, the motorcyclist casually raised a .38 caliber handgun from his waist. He aimed it at the glass and fired a single shot directly into Jeff's face. Jeff's head fell forward onto the car's horn, and suddenly, between the sound of the gunshot and the sound of Jeff's car horn, which was now just blaring constantly, everyone at the gas station and in the nearby BJ's parking lot was thrown into a sudden panic. That is, everyone except for the motorcyclist who had just shot Jeff. While everyone else was screaming and running around and trying to figure out what was going on, the motorcyclist simply turned around, walked calmly back to their bike, and then rode away from the scene as if nothing happened. One of the people who actually saw the shooting take place was the gas station attendant, and within 30 seconds of the shooting, this attendant was on the phone with 911. But by that point, it was already too late for Jeff. He was dead. Jeff had been murdered in front of dozens of people in one of the most crowded shopping centers in the city, and yet, when police arrived just a few minutes after the 911 call, they would discover that not a single witness could actually identify the shooter. In fact, nobody could even say for sure if the shooter was a man or a woman. All that anyone could remember was that the motorcyclist had been wearing a full-faced helmet and that they were riding a green and white Ninja motorcycle. Given the cold-blooded nature of the murder and the fact that it was done in broad daylight in public, the police knew it was only a matter of time before the news of what happened found its way to the victim's family, Jeff's family. To ensure that that was not how the family learned about Jeff's death, not long after arriving on scene and identifying Jeff, police officers radioed back to the station to tell the chief that someone needed to go to Jeff's house ASAP to break the news. 15 minutes later, a pair of detectives arrived in front of Jeff's perfectly landscaped two-story home. And when Jeff's wife, Bonnie, opened the door, the police were apologetic but direct. They told the 46-year-old woman what happened to her husband and asked if she knew of anyone who might want to hurt him. Bonnie leaned against the doorframe as if it was the only thing holding her up. It was clear that Bonnie was shocked by the news of her husband's death, but as Bonnie would tell the detectives, she was not exactly surprised by it. For one thing, Bonnie said, Jeff had a lot of enemies. In fact, Jeff seemed to make enemies wherever he went. He was an aggressive and deeply unhappy person who seemed to enjoy being confrontational. So, as far as Bonnie was concerned, it was definitely possible that Jeff had been killed by someone he had upset. But Bonnie was quick to tell police that she did not think her husband had been killed by a total stranger. Before saying another word, Bonnie scanned the street out front and then invited the detectives to come inside her house where she could explain why she thought this was no random attack. The detectives followed Bonnie into her kitchen, and once they were all seated around the table, Bonnie told them that she believed her husband knew he was going to be killed. She said about a month earlier, Jeff had started acting different. Bonnie admitted that for years, Jeff had been emotionally and physically abusive with her. He also cheated on her constantly, and sometimes, as recently as that morning, he threatened to divorce her. But lately, Bonnie told them, he'd been generally kinder to her, all things considered, which was very noticeable, and he had also begun saying strange things to her that seemed to indicate that he thought he was going to die soon. Bonnie said that 3 weeks earlier, Jeff had taken her down into their basement to show her where he kept his financial papers. Bonnie asked him why he was showing this to her now, all of a sudden, after 15 years of marriage, and Jeff just said it was because he wanted her to know where to find things in case he wasn't around to provide for them. Bonnie thought this was totally ridiculous because her husband seemed totally healthy, and so she didn't think much of it. However, Bonnie told the detectives that just a few days ago, someone had called their house and left a voicemail for Jeff. It was a man who just kept demanding to speak with Jeff, and his tone very obviously suggested he was not happy with Jeff. Bonnie had saved the voicemail and wound up playing it right there in the kitchen for the detectives. And after the short message was over, they agreed that whoever was calling sounded very threatening. Bonnie told detectives that when Jeff came home on the night that this voicemail came through, she immediately played it for Jeff and then asked him who was that. Bonnie would tell detectives that as Jeff listened to this recording, he looked visibly frightened by whoever was on the phone. But he would say to Bonnie that he didn't know who it was or what they wanted, and that Bonnie should just forget about it and move on. But Bonnie could tell her husband was lying. It seemed obvious to her that Jeff knew who this guy was, he knew what he wanted, and he just didn't want to tell her. This information was obviously very interesting to the detectives, but the most interesting thing they would hear while visiting Jeff's house was not this recording or anything Bonnie said. Instead, it was something Jeff and Bonnie's 12-year-old son said. While Bonnie and the detectives sat at the kitchen table talking, Bonnie and Jeff's son came into the house, and after he was told what happened to his father, he was absolutely devastated, but after composing himself, he told police that he might know who killed his father. He said just one night earlier, he had been watching TV with his dad when out of the blue, his dad, Jeff, turned to him and said, "If anything happens to me, Ed George did it." At the mention of this name, Ed George, the detectives' ears perked straight up because they knew who Ed George was. In fact, pretty much anyone who lived in Akron, Ohio, knew who Ed George was. Ed was one of the wealthiest men in Akron, and he owned one of the city's most popular institutions, a place called Tangier. Tangier was part restaurant, part nightclub, and part banquet hall. And over the years, it had played host to major celebrities and personalities, ranging from the Beach Boys to Tina Turner to President George H.W. Bush, and years later, his son, President George W. Bush. There had always been rumors that some of Ed's wealth might be tied to organized crime, but those rumors had never been substantiated. And as far as anyone could tell, Ed was an upstanding citizen. He was an active member of the Catholic Church and a devoted father of 7 kids. So why had Jeff told his son that Ed might hurt him someday? After talking for a while with the son and with Bonnie, the detectives left for the night. The next morning, when the detectives went into the station, they told their colleagues about what Jeff had told his son about Ed George. And in that moment, one of the detectives, a guy named Paul Callahan, suddenly remembered a strange interaction he'd had with Ed about 6 months back. Paul had known Ed for years. Paul was in an Irish folk band that used to play at Ed's restaurant, Tangier, every St. Patrick's Day, So it wasn't weird for Paul to get a social call from Ed every once in a while. But 6 months ago, when Ed called Paul on his office line at the police station, it was not for a social call. On this call, Ed told Paul that some guy had been harassing his wife, Cindy. Paul asked Ed if he knew who this guy was, and Ed said yes. Paul said, "Okay, who is it?" But Ed said he didn't want to tell Paul. He also said he didn't want to file a police report. At first, Paul was confused by this, but he sensed that maybe Ed was just looking for some advice on how to handle the situation on his own. So Paul told Ed to just go confront the guy and tell him to leave Cindy alone. Ed said, "Okay, thank you," and then they both hung up. Now, normally, Paul might have just forgotten about a call like this. Except, this was not the only time Ed called Paul about this guy who was harassing his wife. In fact, just 2 weeks earlier, so roughly 5 months after this first call Paul got from Ed, and only 2 weeks before Jeff's murder, Ed called Paul again to say this guy was still harassing Cindy. After Paul finished telling his colleagues about these strange calls he got from Ed, the whole police department quickly began to wonder if maybe the guy who was harassing Ed's wife was actually Jeff, and maybe Ed did confront Jeff about it, and in the process of this confrontation, Ed killed Jeff. Regardless, the police knew they needed to figure out why Jeff had told his son that he thought Ed was going to hurt him. And who better to ask than Ed himself? So the next day, a team of 4 detectives drove out to Ed George's house, located 20 miles outside of Akron. The house was actually more like a compound. It sat on 18 acres of land and was made up of 2 big buildings. There was the main house, which was a whopping 8,000 square feet, and then there was the second house, which was a separate 4-bedroom home just for Ed and Cindy's servants. The detectives had all heard about how big Ed's property was, but when they turned off the main road and began driving up Ed's long driveway, they were all stunned by the sheer size of everything. The detectives reached the end of the driveway and parked right near the front steps of the main house. Then they climbed out of their vehicle and walked up to the front door and they knocked. A moment later, they heard shuffling feet coming from inside the house. Then the door slowly opened and the detectives were met with one of the George family's nannies. After the nanny said a quick hello, she asked the detectives what they were doing there. And when they explained the situation, the nanny said that Ed was actually not home at the moment. He was out golfing and wouldn't be back for a while. But she said Ed's wife, Cindy, was home if they wanted to talk to her. The detectives tried to act casual. They said, "Okay, yeah, sure, we'll talk to Cindy." But secretly, the detectives were actually thrilled about the prospect of talking to Ed's wife without Ed around to supervise. The detectives knew Cindy from Tangier. She often acted as the hostess. She was warm and charismatic, and she was also extremely beautiful. In fact, just 1 year earlier, Cindy had placed 3rd in the Mrs. Ohio America pageant. But when 47-year-old Cindy emerged from her wing of the house, she looked extremely frail and broken down. The mother of 7 smiled a weak smile and then invited the detectives to join her in one of the family's large sitting rooms. Once they were all settled in, detectives explained that they were there to ask some questions about the death of Jeff Zach. Cindy was nervous, but she told them she would do her best to answer all of their questions. When asked what her husband, Ed, had been doing on the morning that Jeff was murdered, she said he had spent the entire morning at Tangier dealing with a drainage issue. As for her own whereabouts that morning, Cindy said that she was at home with her 7 kids getting everybody ready to go to a friend's wedding that was being held later that afternoon. When the detectives eventually shifted the conversation and asked Cindy directly if Jeff had been the person who was harassing her, Cindy seemed taken aback that they knew about that, but after taking a breath, she looked down and said, "Yes, he was." Cindy said that Jeff had actually been a friend of the family for many years, but at some point earlier that year, he just started calling the house incessantly, asking to talk to Cindy. When asked, Cindy said she did not know why Jeff was calling so much or what he wanted to talk to her about, but she didn't say it confidently, And as she said this, she looked kind of troubled. To the detectives, it seemed like Cindy might be hiding something about Jeff, but she also seemed totally scared about it. So the detectives very gently followed up with another similar question to try to figure out what Cindy knew. They said, well, even if you don't know why he was calling you, could you maybe just take a guess as to what he wanted? Cindy looked down at her hands as if the answer to this question was written somewhere on them, and then, after a long pause, she looked back up at the detectives and shook her head before telling them again she just didn't know. The detectives felt confident that Cindy did know more about Jeff than she was letting on, but they got the feeling that she was not going to open up much more that day. So they very politely wrapped up the conversation, thanked Cindy for her time, and then they made their way back outside to their car and headed back to the station. The next morning, Paul called his old friend Ed and asked him if he wouldn't mind coming into the station so they could ask him some questions about Jeff Zach's murder. Ed responded by saying, of course, me and Cindy will be there soon. But neither Ed nor Cindy would come down to the police station that day. Instead, about an hour after that phone call with Paul, Ed's lawyer showed up at the police station and walked straight up to Paul's desk and informed the detective that his client, Ed George, would not be participating in this investigation. The lawyer then turned around and left. Paul was stunned. He felt like if Ed was innocent, he never would have sent his lawyer in like that. But without evidence tying Ed to Jeff's murder, there was really nothing the police could do. Over the next few weeks, the police tried calling Ed and Cindy's friends and relatives in the hopes that someone would be willing to shed some light on what happened between Ed and Cindy and Jeff. But one after another, Ed's friends and family all declined to speak with law enforcement and just told the detectives to speak with their lawyers instead. And these lawyers, the detectives would discover, were all being paid for by Ed. But again, despite how guilty Ed looked, without evidence, there was really nothing police could do about Ed or how he was conducting himself. So the detectives had to go back to the drawing board. They spent days reviewing the crime scene photos and reading witness statements and playing Bonnie's voicemail tape over and over again, but none of that got them anywhere. And then, one day, the detectives realized they'd missed something. The detectives were sitting around at a conference table talking in circles about the case when one of the detectives picked up a photo of the George family, and this detective immediately noticed something. In this photo were Ed and Cindy and their 7 kids. 2 of their kids were adopted, and so of course they looked nothing like Ed or Cindy. But as this detective stared at this photo, they noticed that 4 of the 5 biological children looked exactly like Ed and Cindy. But the 5th biological child, the youngest, the 8-year-old, looked nothing like Ed or Cindy. Instead, this youngest child looked just like the murder victim, Jeff Zach. The detective who noticed this turned the photo around to show her colleagues, and after looking it over, they all agreed. And if this 8-year-old child was indeed Jeff's child, not Ed's, then the child was clear evidence of an affair happening between Cindy and Jeff, which would give Jeff a reason for wanting to call Cindy all the time, and it would give Ed a motive for wanting to kill Jeff. When the detectives brought this theory to the county prosecutor's office, they agreed. There was enough evidence to get a warrant that would force the Georges to take a paternity test. So that's what they did. The warrant was issued, and on August 24th, 2001, a little more than 2 months after Jeff's murder, Ed and Cindy, along with the 8-year-old youngest child, arrived in a doctor's office to take a court-ordered DNA test. And sure enough, when the results came back 3 weeks later, it would show that Jeff was the father of this child, not Ed. The George family was notified by phone, so the detectives didn't get to see how Ed or Cindy reacted to the news. But when the results of this paternity test made it to the local press, people were absolutely shocked. Ed and Cindy were like local celebrities, and they seemed like the perfect couple. So this news about Cindy's affair quickly swept through the city, and soon locals would begin openly speculating about the possibility that Ed had hired a hitman to murder his wife's lover, Jeff. And it wasn't just the locals who thought this was what happened. The police also suspected that this was a professional hit. And so they began scouring Ed's phone records, his bank statements, and questioned every Tangier employee willing to speak to them in order to find the evidence they needed that proved Jeff's murder was an assassination paid for by Ed. But after months of looking, they found nothing, and so it was starting to look like this case was going to go cold. However, about 1 year after the murder, a new tip would come into the station that would lead the detectives in a roundabout way to the home of a 40-year-old single mother named Christine Todero, and she would break the case wide open. Christine seemed to have no apparent connection to the case, but she believed that her ex-husband was the masked motorcycle-riding hitman, the man who killed Jeff Zach. And the reason she believed this was because one time, when she was speaking on the phone with her ex, he made this joke about him being the killer. But Christine suspected he was not actually joking, because during her brief marriage to him, 35-year-old John Zaffino had been violent and dangerous. In fact, Christine left him because he punched her 13-year-old son in the face and, in a separate incident, broke Christine's arm intentionally. When Christine listened to the mysterious voicemail that Jeff's wife Bonnie had shown police, where some guy was demanding to speak to Jeff, Christine's eyes shot wide open and she said, "Yes, 100%, that is my ex-husband, John." After that, detectives would run a search on any and all vehicles registered in John's name, and by noon, they had a full report in their hands. Everybody at the station got a copy of this report, and together, the detectives reviewed it line by line, scanning for anything that could tie John to Jeff's murder. And within minutes, the detectives found what they were looking for. According to the report, in May of 2001, less than 1 month before Jeff's murder, John had purchased a motorcycle from a dealership outside of Akron. And when police called that dealership, the manager told them that the bike John had purchased was a black ninja-style bike with a green stripe, just like the one ridden by the person who killed Jeff. Detectives would also discover that in that same month, John had also purchased a weapon, a .38 caliber handgun, the same kind of gun that killed Jeff. But while John certainly looked like the prime murder suspect, there were still 2 questions the detectives were struggling to answer. The first was, why would John do this? There was no connection between him and Jeff whatsoever. So was he just a hitman, potentially hired by Ed? Nobody knew. The second question was, how could John afford the very expensive motorcycle and gun? The police had done a lot of digging on John, and they knew he did not have very much money. In fact, John was so deep in debt, he couldn't even afford his own apartment. The police would spend months searching for the answers to these 2 general questions, and by the time John was arrested in September of 2002, detectives would be convinced that both of these questions actually had the same answer, and that answer was Sparky. Sparky was the nickname John had given to a woman he met one night in the summer of 2000, about a year before Jeff's murder. That summer, John was standing outside of a restaurant in Akron when he saw this woman, Sparky, walking toward her car. She was beautiful, she was alone, and to John, she looked really sad. So John walked up to her and started a conversation. And quickly, in this conversation, Sparky would tell John that she was married, to which he said he didn't care because he was married too, to Christine. John reached into his pocket and pulled out an old gum wrapper and then wrote his phone number on it, and then he handed the paper to Sparky and asked her to please call him that night after she got home so he would know she arrived safely. Sparky would indeed call John later that night when she got home, and they would chat for a while, nothing more. But not long after this first interaction, Sparky began sneaking off from her husband to go meet up with John. Now, at the time, John did not have a steady source of income or an apartment of his own. So, not long after they met, Sparky moved John into an apartment that she paid for where they could spend the nights alone together. She also paid all of John's other bills and bought him a cell phone so she could reach him whenever she wanted. It was an extremely passionate love affair, but they both talked openly about the future and how maybe there was some way for them to be together long term. However, Sparky made it very clear that no matter what, she would never, ever leave her husband. Before she married her husband, she had nothing. She was a poor coal miner's daughter living in a 200-square-foot house with 3 other people. But now, through her husband, she had a home and she had some nice things, and so she was not prepared to give any of that up. However, things in Sparky's married life were far from perfect, as John would find out one night in January of 2001, roughly 6 months after meeting Sparky. That January night, Sparky called John hysterically crying. She told him that an ex-boyfriend of hers was giving her serious problems. It would turn out John was not the first man Sparky had had an affair with. It would also turn out that this other guy was not technically Sparky's ex-boyfriend, at least not yet. Sparky had been seeing this other guy for nearly a decade, and she had tried to break it off with him many times in the past, but each time, he always figured out a way to rope her back in. But now that Sparky was with John, she finally had the courage to tell this other guy that it was really over. And so she had told him that she did not want to see him again or have any contact with him whatsoever. And this made the now ex-boyfriend absolutely furious. He started threatening to hurt Sparky and her children, and he threatened to expose their secret relationship to the public. Sparky was terrified and didn't know what to do. John's reaction to all of this was not being upset with Sparky for seeing another man. Instead, John's reaction was fear. He was scared that if this ex-boyfriend exposed Sparky, then Sparky's husband would divorce her, and suddenly Sparky wouldn't have all that money that she got from her husband, and so Sparky would not be able to pay for John's life. Because remember, Sparky is paying for John's apartment, she's paying all his bills, she's paying for everything. And so John couldn't have that happen. He needed to make sure Sparky and her husband stayed married for his sake. And so naturally, a plan was made to murder Sparky's very troublesome ex-boyfriend, whose real name was Jeff Zack. No one knows for sure if Sparky or John initiated this murder plan, but what investigators do know is that in May of 2001, about 1 month before Jeff Zack was murdered, Sparky withdrew $5,300 from her bank account. And then 3 hours later, John used that same amount of money to buy the black Ninja-style bike with the green stripe. Also that same month, John purchased a handgun from one of his colleagues at the trucking company where he worked. A couple weeks after that, John quit his job at the trucking company because, as John told one of his colleagues, his girlfriend was going to be, quote, setting him up in business. 1 week later, on Saturday, June 17th, 2001, the day before Father's Day, John suited up in full-body leather and put on a full-faced motorcycle helmet over his head. Then he rode his brand new motorcycle to BJ's Wholesale to wait for Jeff. John knew that Jeff would most likely swing by BJ's at some point that day because usually on Saturdays, Jeff would go to BJ's to buy candy to restock his vending machines. And so at 11:49 a.m., Sparky, aka Cindy George, mother of 7, called her lover and hitman, John, on the cell phone she had bought for him. The pair talked on the phone while John rode in circles on his motorcycle around the BJ's parking lot, hoping, praying that Jeff would show up. That call would end at 11:56, just as John spotted Jeff pulling into the parking lot in his Ford Explorer. As Jeff pulled up to one of the gas pumps, John pulled up right behind him. Then, after Jeff had fueled his vehicle and gotten back inside, John got off his motorcycle, pulled the handgun out of his saddlebag, and then walked right up to Jeff's driver's side window, aimed his gun, and fired a single shot directly into Jeff's face. In the confusion that followed, John managed to hop back on his motorcycle and ride quickly away from the scene without being followed. About 20 minutes later, when he'd reached a safe distance from the crime scene, he called Cindy again. We don't know exactly what was said on that call, but it's assumed that on this call, John told Cindy that he had just killed Jeff and that she no longer had to worry about her marriage to Ed falling apart. But, of course, whatever peace that murder brought for Cindy and John was short-lived. Because in June of 2003, almost exactly 2 years after Jeff was murdered, John was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. Cindy would be arrested a year and a half after John went to jail, and then 11 months after her arrest, Cindy would be convicted of conspiracy to commit murder and sentenced to life in prison as well. However, Cindy's conviction would not stand. Less than 2 years after being sentenced, her conviction was overturned on appeal. The justices ruled that the evidence presented in her trial was insufficient to prove her guilt. And so, on March 22, 2007, almost 6 years after the murder of Jeff Zach, Cindy George was released from prison. And waiting for her outside the prison walls were her 7 kids and her husband, Ed. After a long, tearful embrace, the family hopped into a car and took Cindy back to their giant estate outside of Akron, where she and her family still live today. In 2018, a 56-year-old father of 4 named Tayeb Suyami was living in a quiet, modest town in New Jersey called Little Ferry. Tayeb had moved to the United States from Africa back in 1996, and after getting settled in New Jersey, he had landed a job as an accountant for a food importing company. At first, Tayeb's salary had been enough to provide for the family, but as his family grew, his salary just wasn't enough, and money became a real problem. And so eventually, Tayeb's wife also got a full-time job, but even then, with 2 full-time working adults, the family had to stay on a very strict budget just to make ends meet. And that year, in 2018, one of Tayeb's daughters was getting ready to go to college, and so Tayeb was forced to refinance his mortgage just to make the initial payments on his child's college bills. But despite his financial struggles, Tayeb did not let it bother him. He was an eternal optimist who fundamentally believed that in the end, everything would just work itself out. On May 1st of that year, Tayeb was on his way home from work when his wife called him and asked if he would swing by the grocery store and pick up some orange juice. So Tayeb stopped at the ShopRite grocery store in Hackensack, New Jersey, which was only a couple miles north of Little Ferry where they lived. And he went inside, he went to the juice aisle, and he scanned the different brands of orange juice, and at some point he grabbed the most appealing orange juice that was still within their budget. It was $5. He takes the juice, he goes to the front of the store, he pays for it, he goes outside, he hops in his car, and he heads home. When he pulls into his driveway, he gets out, he goes into the house, he goes right into the kitchen where his wife was, and he proudly set the orange juice down on the kitchen table, expecting a thank you from his wife. But his wife turned around and she looked at the orange juice and she saw the brand he had purchased, and she immediately said, "How much did you pay for that?" And Tayeb said, $5. And she said, "Well, you got to take it back because I know that brand is on sale for $2.50 at the grocery store right down the road, so go return this one." And so Tayeb was totally annoyed because he just got home from work, he thought he had done a good deed, and now he's in trouble. And so he decided, you know what, I'm not going to fight her on this. He just walked over, grabbed the $5 orange juice, and he went back outside, hopped in his car, and took off. A few minutes later, he arrived at the Hackensack, New Jersey ShopRite. He went inside, and he went straight to the customer service desk where there was a teenager behind the counter. And Tayeb walked over to them, and he handed them the juice along with his receipt, and he asked for a refund. And so while Tayeb is standing there letting this cashier complete the transaction, he looked behind the cashier at the wall, and there was this sign that totally piqued his interest. And so he's staring at the sign, and then finally the teenage cashier, he finishes the transaction, and he reaches out across the counter with Tayeb's $5. And Tayeb, he reaches out and he takes the $5, but then he pauses for a second. And he's kind of looking up at the sign, and he's thinking about what he should do. And he knows that if he does this, if he does what the sign is telling him to do, he's going to get in trouble with his wife, because this is the exact opposite of what he was sent out to do. But Tayeb just couldn't help it, and he takes the $5 and he proceeds to hand it right back to the cashier, and he tells the cashier what he wants him to do with it. And so a couple minutes later, Tayeb leaves the ShopRite with no juice, with no $5, but 2 small slips of paper in his back pocket. And so Tayyab hops in his car and he drives to the grocery store that's right down the road from their house. He goes inside and he gets the on sale $2.50 bottle of orange juice. And then he goes back into his car, he drives home, he goes in the kitchen and he sets the juice on the counter and tells his wife, yep, I got the right one, $2.50. And he's just hoping the whole time that she has not checked the bank account and has not discovered what he had really been doing while he was out, because he had actually spent more money on the second trip than the first time. But apparently his wife had not checked the account yet, and she just thanked him for being willing to go out and get the better deal. And so Tayyab very happily left the kitchen, and he spent the rest of the night watching TV and hanging out with his family. And then early the next morning, Tayyab got up and he decided, you know what? I need to do something to curry some favor with my wife because she's gonna learn what I did with the refund money pretty soon. And so he decided he would just go out and do a bunch of yard work that day, right in front of his wife, to make sure she really saw that he was doing some good stuff. And so he goes outside, he opens up the garage, and he's about to pull the lawnmower out when he notices his car is really dirty. And so he decides, you know what, I'm gonna go wash my car first and then come back and cut the grass and do some other things. And so he goes inside and he tells his wife what his plan is. And she says, okay, I'll see you in a little bit when you come back from the car wash. And then Tayyab went back outside, he hopped in his car, and he left. As he was driving to the car wash, he made a pit stop at a small store that was set back off the road. And so he goes inside and he goes right to the back of this little store where there's this strange machine that looks like an ATM, and it has a screen on it with text scrolling across it. And at the bottom, there was an opening where a barcode scanner was kind of projecting down. And so Tayyab walks up to this machine and he reaches into his back pocket and he pulls out those 2 slips of paper he had got from the grocery store cashier the night before, and he puts the first one under the scanner, and then he reads the text that appears on the screen of this machine. And after reading it, he kind of shrugs his shoulders and puts that piece of paper back in his pocket. And then the second slip of paper he puts into the scanner. And then when he reads the words that pop up on the screen, he thinks there's been a mistake because all it says is "see receptionist." And so he rescans the second slip of paper to see if something different will happen. But sure enough, again, it just says "see receptionist." And so he pulls the second slip of paper out of the scanner, he turns around and he walks to the front of the store and he hands the paper to the woman behind the counter. Over an hour later, Tayyab pulled into his driveway and he sat in his driveway for a second. He was still shaking from what had just happened inside of that small store. And so he gets out of his car, which was still totally dirty, and he made his way into the house and he went straight to the kitchen where his wife was. And so as soon as he gets in the kitchen, his wife turns around and looks at him and says, "Where were you? The car wash is like 5 minutes away. Why were you gone for like 2 hours?" But Tayyab, he's got no expression on his face and he looks at his wife and just says, "Give me $100. And his wife scrunches her face up at him and says, "No, where's your money?" And Tayyab smiles, he turns around, he reaches into his back pocket, and he pulls out that second slip of paper, and he hands it to his wife, and he says, "Here's my money." After getting that $5 refund at the ShopRite in Hackensack, New Jersey, Tayyab noticed a sign on the back wall that was advertising for a Moneyball jackpot lottery. And he had decided to use the $5 refund to buy 2 lottery tickets. And so he buys these 2 lottery tickets, and the next day, that store set back off the road he went to was a convenience store, a 7-Eleven, and the machine he was using was a machine that scanned your lottery tickets to see if they were winners. And so the first ticket he scanned, it was a dud, it didn't win anything. But the second ticket, when he scanned it, it couldn't process the amount of money he had just won. And so that's why it told him to see the receptionist. And so he brought the second ticket up to the counter, he handed it to the woman, and after she scanned it and saw the amount of money he had won, all she could do was say, "Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God." And when he asked her, "What are you looking at? What happened?" She just goes, "Big." And so when he got home, Tayyab handed that slip to his wife, and on it was the amount of money that he had won. He was the jackpot winner. He had won $315 million. Tayyab would say that he and his wife and his kids all laughed and cried and celebrated in the kitchen all night. And within a couple of days, Tayyab had left his job, he retired, and he had paid off all of his family's debts. And at his press conference for the New Jersey lottery, he was quoted as saying, "I love orange juice now." Our next story is called Overcoming Adversity. In 1959, Ronald McNair was a very gifted 9-year-old African-American boy living in South Carolina. While he was good at virtually everything he tried, from music to athletics to schoolwork, the only thing that ever really grabbed his attention was outer space. And so as a 9-year-old child, he made the decision that one day he was going to become an astronaut. But he had no idea how to become an astronaut. And so he decided the first thing he would do would be to go to his library and take out some books on NASA, the very famous organization that sends American astronauts to space. However, there was an issue with his plan. This library only served white patrons. It was a segregated library. Ronald knew this, but he figured, you know what, I'm a polite kid. I can get in there and get out before anybody notices me. But as soon as he walked into that library, everybody in there, who were all white, just stared at Ronald. Ronald could feel it, but he just kept his head down and he walked through the library. He got to the science section, he grabbed a couple books he wanted, and then he walked back to the counter and he put them up and he very politely asked the librarian, who was also white, if he could check these books out. And this librarian looks at him and says, "Young man, you better get out of here before I call the police." And Ronald, at this point, looks up at the librarian and thinks for a second, and then just hops up onto her counter and sits there and says, "Okay, I'll wait for the police." The librarian was totally outraged and would call the police and would call Ronald's mother. And before long, the police did show up, and it was two white guys. They come inside and this librarian runs over to them and she's talking to them and she's pointing back over at Ronald, gesticulating that very clearly Ronald is the issue. That's why you've been called here. And the officers would be just totally annoyed by this librarian. And they would say to her, "Why don't you just let the kid take the books out?" And the librarian was totally offended at this and began defending her decision to call the police instead of letting him take the books out. And as she's defending herself, Ronald's mother comes running into the library. She runs over to her son to make sure he's okay. And then she looks up at the police officers and this librarian to try to figure out what's going on. And at this point, the police officers are just totally over it. And they turn to the librarian and they say, "You know what? You really ought to let him take the books out." And then the officers just turned around and left. The librarian was not about to just let him take the books. She was still very upset. And so she storms over to Ronald's mother and she says to her, "You shouldn't let your son come in here." And at this, Ronald's mother is looking at this librarian who's totally upset, and she looks down at her son who's got his head down, and then she notices the few books on the counter about space, and she was aware of Ronald's love for outer space, and she put together what had happened. And after thinking about it for a moment, she looks up at this librarian and she just says, "Well, since he's here already, can he take out those books? He'll take good care of them." The librarian is still totally furious, but knows this is a losing fight. And so very reluctantly, with a scowl on her face, she grabs the books and she jams them into Ronald's arms. And Ronald's mother nudges Ronald and says, "What do you say?" And Ronald, while holding all of his new books about NASA and space, looks up at the librarian and smiles and says, "Thank you, ma'am." And then he and his mom turn around and they leave. Ronald would go on to earn his PhD in physics from MIT, one of the most prestigious universities in the world, and after graduation, he was picked up by NASA to become an astronaut. And in 1984, Ronald went into outer space. He was actually the second African American to ever go into outer space. And while he was in orbit, apparently he played his saxophone for his crew. And then in 1986, Ronald was chosen again to go on another mission to outer space, but tragically, 73 seconds after takeoff, their space shuttle, the Challenger, exploded, killing Ronald and the 6 other astronauts on board. Following his death, the library in South Carolina that had tried to turn Ronald away for his skin color renamed themselves the Ronald McNair Life History Center. Our next story is called Cowboy. In 1963, when Tim Dick was just 10 years old, he went over to his friend's house and he snuck a bottle of whiskey from one of their shelves. He pulled it out and he poured himself a full glass to the brim with whiskey, and then he downed it in one huge gulp. Tim had grown up idolizing cowboys on TV, and every time he watched them, they would come galloping into some town, they would go into the saloon, and they would sit at the bar just throwing back shots of whiskey. And so Tim always assumed whiskey must be this totally amazing, refreshing drink for these guys to be drinking it out in the heat of the desert. But unfortunately for Tim, after he slugged this huge glass of whiskey, it was not refreshing. It tasted like gasoline, and his chest felt like it was on fire. But instead of being turned off by alcohol and waiting until he was older and of age to try it again, Tim instead thought, you know what? The next time I have whiskey, I just need to water it down a little bit. And so for the next year, Tim continued to periodically sneak whiskey out of his friends' cabinets, and he would drink this watered down whiskey. And then when he turned 11 years old, his father, who he was very close with, died tragically in a car accident. And Tim really didn't have a good way to cope with the grief of losing his father, and so he turned to drinking even more than he already was. And before long, Tim was like this young kid who basically was an alcoholic. But he hid it extremely well. He graduated high school, he graduated college, and really nobody knew he was drinking as much as he was. But after he graduated college and he was living on his own in Michigan, there was no structure in place or person in place to stop Tim from going overboard with his substance abuse. And so not only did his drinking get completely out of control, but he began using and selling drugs, namely cocaine. In 1978, when Tim was 25 years old, he and his drug dealing partner were scheduled to take part in the biggest drug deal of their careers. They would be selling about 1.5 pounds of cocaine to a guy named Michael Pfeiffer, and he'd be buying it for $42,000, which when you adjust that for inflation, would be like buying it for $175,000 in 2021. Tim and his partner were very excited about all this money they were going to make, but they were equally worried about the transaction. A lot can go wrong. And so Tim decided, in order to mitigate their nerves and kind of make this a safer drug deal, he decided they would do the transaction inside of a public airport, because Tim had seen that done on TV and believed that would give them an additional layer of safety. And so on the day this deal is going to take place, Tim takes the 1.5 pounds of cocaine, he puts it inside of a brown Adidas gym bag, and he also throws a key lock inside of this bag. He zips it up, he walks outside, he dumps the bag in the back of his car, and he drives to the Kalamazoo International Airport in Michigan. When he gets there, he parks in the big parking lot right outside of the front doors. And as soon as he's parked, he goes around to the back of his car. He pulls out this brown Adidas bag. He throws it over his shoulder, shuts his trunk, and then he waits for his partner to show up. A couple of minutes later, right on time, his partner pulls into the lot. He parks nearby. And then the two of them very casually begin walking towards the front doors of this airport. They walk up the steps, they go in the front doors, and as soon as they're inside, they're looking around and they find Michael Pfeiffer. He's standing up against the wall right in the area he had said he would be. And so without making any sort of contact with Michael, Tim and his partner turn the corner and they go into a nearby locker room. Once they're inside, Tim pulls the lock out of the brown bag, and then he puts the bag with the drugs in it inside of a locker. He shuts it and then uses the lock he had just pulled out to lock the locker. And then he and his partner leave the locker room. As soon as they go out into the main terminal, they start walking over towards Michael Pfeiffer. And as they get closer and closer, Tim's partner breaks off and goes to a bench on the other side of the terminal. And Tim continues walking on right up to Michael. And then when he reaches Michael, he very discreetly hands him the key to the lock on the locker. And he tells him which locker number the drugs are in. Michael doesn't say anything. He takes the key and he heads off to the locker room. Tim turns and he goes over to his partner and he sits down on the bench and waits. Meanwhile, Michael goes inside the locker room. He uses the key. He opens up the lock. He opens the locker up. He checks to make sure the drugs are still there. They are. As soon as that's confirmed, he takes the bag, he throws it over his shoulder, and he walks back out to the main terminal to meet up with Tim and his partner. Tim and his partner are sitting on the bench. They see Michael coming out of the locker room, and they're expecting Michael to walk over and basically hand them a bag full of $42,000. But instead, Michael walks up to them and draws a gun and points it at them and says, "I'm a police officer. You're under arrest." It would turn out this was a sting operation. Michael Pfeiffer, the undercover police officer, had been following around Tim and his partner for months. In Michigan at the time, if you were caught trying to sell 650 grams or more of cocaine, there was an automatic penalty of a life sentence. And Tim and his partner had just been arrested trying to sell more than 650 grams of cocaine. And so facing a life sentence, Tim took a deal that gave him a lesser sentence in exchange for information about other drug dealers. And so Tim would ultimately serve 2 years and 4 months in a federal penitentiary before he was released. Tim would say his time in prison was absolutely miserable, but it was necessary. It matured him in a major way, and it honed his sense of humor. Tim was always a very funny guy. He was always the class clown and the guy goofing around. But in prison, he found it a very difficult task to get these hardened prisoners and prison guards to laugh at his jokes. But eventually, with enough practice and repetition, he could get anybody in that prison to laugh at him. And so by the time he got out, he was like an amazing comedian. And so he decided, you know what? Why don't I pursue a career in comedy? 4 years later, Tim Dick, better known as Tim Allen, landed the starring role on the hit TV show Home Improvement. And from there, he starred in dozens more movies and TV shows, but he's probably best known for his voice acting in the very popular movie series Toy Story, where he plays Buzz Lightyear. Today, Tim is sober and has been for decades. The next and final story of today's episode is called Pick Your Poison. On June 14th, 2011, 42-year-old Ellie Lobel stepped unsteadily outside of her house in Wildomar, California, and immediately she had to lean on her round-the-clock caretaker for support. This mother of 3 had just moved to this rural part of California so she could die in peace. For the last 15 years, Ellie had been battling Lyme disease, which is a chronic and debilitating condition spread by ticks. But now, after those 15 years of fighting, Ellie just had no more energy. She could barely stand up on her own, her mind was kind of always in this weird fog, and she just felt totally hopeless. And so Ellie had recently hired an end-of-life coordinator to help her plan for her death and also to make sure nobody attempted to revive or resuscitate Ellie if she fell unconscious. Ellie really thought she was going to die any moment and just wanted it to happen in peace in California in her bed. But dying can be complicated, and Ellie, after moving to California, had laid in her bed for 3 days expecting to die, but didn't. And so, on June 14th, Ellie decided she would just get up, and with the help of her caretaker, she would just go for a walk in her new town. Every step was painful for Ellie as she clutched her caretaker's arm, but the sun was out, the sky was blue, and flowers were in bloom all around her, and just for a moment, Ellie suddenly realized she was feeling something she had not felt in a long time. She was feeling grateful to be alive. But that feeling was very short-lived because as she stood on this sunny sidewalk in California, she suddenly felt something small and sharp smack into her forehead. And Ellie, she kind of looked up and realized it was a bee. Now, she was determined not to let an insect ruin this rare instance of happiness in her life. Ellie just kind of reached up and tried to swat it away. But when she looked up again, she noticed the bee was still there, and worse, there was now an entire cloud, a swarm of bees over her head that were descending down on her. And as this happened, Ellie's caretaker, who saw the swarm, screamed, let go of Ellie, and ran away from her. And so poor old Ellie, who couldn't even stand up on her own, was forced to fall to the ground and kind of cover her head with her hands to try to protect herself. But within seconds, these bees had descended on her and were stinging her head, her ears, her face. I mean, she was getting destroyed. And these were not normal bees. These were African killer bees that were known for stinging their victim dozens of times. And Ellie was fiercely allergic to bee stings. And so instead of dying a peaceful death in her bed, Ellie was now going to die a viciously painful, awful public death out on the sidewalk all by herself. Ellie's life had started out with so much promise. By the time she was just 18 years old, she had already earned her PhD in physics. And then by 1996, when she was 27 years old, Ellie and her husband had 3 beautiful children, and they had moved into their dream home in New York's Westchester County. Her life really seemed perfect. But that same year they moved into their dream home, Ellie suddenly noticed there was this rash at the top of her thigh, and it kind of looked like a red bullseye, and Ellie had chalked it up to, some sort of weird spider bite and not thought much of it, not realizing that that bullseye marking is actually the calling card for ticks who carry Lyme disease. That's what they leave behind after they bite you. But Ellie didn't know that, and so not long after seeing this rash, Ellie began having night sweats and night shakes. She had these flu-like symptoms that didn't go away for months, and it left her totally exhausted and discouraged. Doctors told her that she could have arthritis, or fibromyalgia, or MS, or heart failure, or some other horrible condition, but it was ultimately a park ranger that Ellie just happened to meet one day who recognized that that rash she described at the top of her leg was very likely because she had been bit by a tick that had Lyme disease, and now all of these symptoms, that seemed like Lyme disease too. And then when Ellie went into the doctor and said, "I think I have Lyme disease," they said, "Yep, you do, but now the disease has progressed so far, it's basically too late for you." And so for years, Ellie wasn't able to work or really even be a mother because of this disease. And then eventually her marriage fell apart and ended in bitter divorce. And so this disease really had just kind of wrecked Ellie's life. And so at the 15-year mark of having this disease, she decided, you know what, enough is enough. I'm going to California and I'm going to die on my own terms. But Ellie had envisioned a peaceful death in her bed, not an agonizing death caused by a barrage of African killer bee stings out on a sidewalk in some random town in California. The attack on Ellie lasted maybe about a minute, but it was the longest minute of Ellie's life. The pain was just unimaginable. And then after all the bees had left, Ellie's caretaker actually came running back over to her, scooped her up, and began running with her back to the car. And as Ellie was getting carried, Ellie realized her caretaker was probably going to take her to the hospital, and she didn't want that. Even though she had had that kind of nice moment before the bee stings when she was looking around at this beautiful town and the sun was out and the flowers were out, that wasn't enough to inspire her to want to live. She still, deep down, did just want to die. And so she figured, with these bee stings, I'm going to have an allergic reaction any minute now, and that's going to take me out, and I just want it to happen so I can be done. And so Ellie made her caretaker drive her back to the house and put her in bed, and then Ellie laid there waiting to die. But 3 days later, and Ellie had not died yet. In fact, she actually felt the best she had felt in years. There had been no discernible allergic reaction to all of these bee stings all over her head, and all the chronic pain and discomfort that she normally felt all the time from Lyme disease was gone. And after doing some research about bee stings and about Lyme disease, Ellie came across this 1997 study done in Australia that found the active ingredient in some wasp and bee stings was powerful enough to kill the bacteria that causes Lyme disease. But no one had ever really researched this because it was totally unethical to release a swarm of bees on a critical Lyme disease patient. But in Ellie's case, this happened on its own, and it really did cure her. The bee stings literally saved her life. And since her bee attack, Ellie has become the leading advocate for bee venom as a treatment for Lyme disease.
There's a static glow beneath my veins, an ocean folded into glass. I hear the hum, I taste the air. I'm not home, but I'm almost there.
Thank you for listening to the MrBallen's podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. They are this one, of course, MrBallen's Podcast, and we also have MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, we have Bedtime Stories, and also Run Fool. To find those other podcasts, all you have to do is search for Ballen Studios wherever you listen to your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like the ones you heard today, head over to our